6 shots, 6 bodies, 0 witnesses. That was the first and last fact of the case. Welcome to Mr. Nightmare. November 13th, 1974. The police arrived at 112 Ocean Avenue after Ronald DeFeo Jr. reported his family murdered. The first officers on the scene were confronted with a sequence of impossible facts. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house was cold, filled with an unnatural stillness. The true shock was upstairs. 6 members of the DeFeo family were dead, shot with a .35 caliber rifle. The scene defied established crime procedure. There was no struggle. There were no defensive wounds. All 6 victims were found face down in their beds, executed while they slept. The ultimate physical paradox was the weapon itself. The Marlin rifle was loud. Forensic analysis confirmed the blast should have shattered the quiet of the street. Yet no neighbor reported hearing anything. The victims showed no resistance, and the community offered no testimony. This silence, the failure of the victims to wake up, the failure of the community to hear, was the single greatest investigative anomaly. It forced the police immediately to look inward, away from the easy theories and directly at the one person who stood hysterical outside, Ronald DeFeo Jr. The evidence suggested a terrifying, cold certainty. The killer had complete unexplained compliance from every person inside that house. To truly grasp the devastating contradiction of the scene police faced, we must move beyond the shock of the bodies and examine the environment that cultivated the violence. 112 Ocean Avenue was, by every external metric, the embodiment of the American suburban ideal in 1974. It was a sprawling, expensive Dutch colonial, a 3-story fortress of brick, wealth and quiet affluence. This architectural beauty was the ultimate facade, a perfect shield designed to project stability onto the world. This outward perfection was the killer's greatest alibi. Who would suspect such calculated internal destruction could occur in such a home? Yet this house was not merely a structure. It was a gilded cage designed to contain the explosive psychological decay of the family living inside its walls. The environment of the home was defined by one fact: fear. The patriarch, Ronald DeFeo Sr., a successful manager at his family's car dealership, was not just a strict father. He was a brutally domineering and physically abusive tyrant. His successful business life starkly contrasted with his violent domestic life. His emotional atmosphere dictated the flow of life within the home. Ronald Sr. enforced absolute control, dictating every aspect of his wife Louise's and his children's lives through intimidation, humiliation, and frequent, explosive physical assaults. This continuous low-level domestic terror was the family's central gaping vulnerability, the systemic weakness that the eventual massacre would exploit without resistance. The victims were conditioned to silence. The tension reached its breaking point around the figure of Ronald DeFeo Jr. Butch. At 23, Butch was caught in a lethal trap. He was economically dependent on his father's money and patronage, having been given a non-essential job at the family dealership, but he was simultaneously suffocated by his father's constant surveillance and criticism. Butch's emotional life was defined by the relentless cycle of craving his father's approval, only to be met with cutting public and private humiliation. This house was the physical manifestation of the expectations he could not meet and the authority he desperately needed to overthrow. The sprawling luxury of Ocean Avenue was not a reward for Butch. It was a constant, suffocating reminder of his subjugation. The pressure inside the house was not supernatural. It was a devastating cocktail of financial greed, power abuse, and severe addiction. Butch was deeply involved in narcotics, specifically mixing alcohol with heroin and mind-altering substances. This drug abuse served as the critical chemical accelerator for his inherent rage. It did not create a demon, but it stripped away the fragile walls of rational thought, amplifying his paranoia and blurring the rigid lines between his homicidal fantasies and his terrifying reality. The frequent loud arguments between father and son over money and the car dealership were the actual noise in the house, a predictable toxic rhythm that the neighborhood, accustomed to the DeFeo's volatility, often ignored. The silence of the suburbs shielded the violence within. The very construction of the house played a role in the coming isolation. Large, detached, and surrounded by affluent, separated neighbors, the house was perfectly engineered to contain the sound of a breakdown. Its wealth ensured its privacy, guaranteeing that the predictable, escalating psychological violence would remain invisible and unheard by the outside world. The house was not merely the stage. It was an active structural barrier that helped isolate the impending tragedy. The seeds of the massacre were not planted by an external curse. They were nurtured by the predictable combination of toxic wealth, chemical addiction, and unchecked parental tyranny that created a perfect pressure cooker. The violence that followed was entirely human, born of years of accumulated rage, and its finality was the catastrophic result of a family system that allowed one person's rage to become the law of the land. The events that climaxed in the early morning of November 13, 1974, were not a sudden tragedy. They were the predetermined, devastating explosion of the pressure cooker established inside 112 Ocean Avenue. The final day was marked by the toxic, predictable buildup of tension, culminating in the omen that signaled the final hours. The ultimate confrontation, hours before the massacre, was predictably about money and absolute control. Ronald DeFeo Sr. and his son, Ronnie Jr., were embroiled in yet another bitter, highly public argument over the dealership and the family's finances. Ronald Sr. had once again cut off his son's allowance, tightening the financial noose and leaving the volatile young man financially desperate and consumed by a familiar humiliation. This specific, tangible argument was the immediate psychological trigger, pushing Ronnie Jr.'s long-simmering resentment, the accumulated poison of years of abuse, to an irrevocable breaking point. Compounding this familial rage was the crucial chemical catalyst that broke the barrier of sanity. Ronnie Jr.'s heavy narcotic abuse. He was deep into an intense self-destructive pattern, mixing alcohol with potent substances including LSD and heroin. This chemical cocktail did not summon a demon. It simply dissolved the last vestiges of rational thought, amplifying his inherent paranoia and blurring the rigid lines between homicidal fantasy and action. His consciousness, already fractured by years of emotional abuse, Part 2, was now chemically primed for violence. The combination was lethal. Overwhelming rage fueled by a chemically unstable mind searching for an ultimate release from his gilded prison. The shift from simmering rage to calculated execution began in the tense, dead quiet hours leading up to 3 a.m. Having returned to the house, likely after consuming more substances, Ronnie Jr. descended into the darkness of the lower level, a stark contrast to the quiet, sleeping victims upstairs. His first methodical action was to secure the weapon of choice, the Marlin 336C high-powered rifle, a weapon designed for hunting deer, not domestic execution. The use of this specific tool immediately elevated the impending act from a desperate, emotional outburst to a cold, systematic operation. The very nature of the rifle dictated the required silence and speed of the attacks. The final time window, around 3:15 a.m., provided the ultimate opportunity for the killer. The entire family, 6 separate individuals, was in the deepest, most vulnerable phase of their sleep cycle. The house was utterly submerged in the thick, trusting quiet of the suburbs, a stillness that Ronnie Jr. knew well. This profound, trusting quiet became the definitive omen, the final signal that the victims had utterly disarmed themselves, both physically and psychologically. Their final collective act of trust was falling asleep in a home they thought was their fortress. The transition from thought to action was swift and terrifyingly mechanical. With the loaded rifle in his hands, fueled by psychosis and years of resentment, Ronnie Jr. climbed the stairs. He did not encounter locked doors or resistance. He faced the victims only in the total surrender of their sleep. The execution was cold, systematic, and brutal. He began methodically firing 6 clean shots, ensuring the adults were neutralized first, followed by his 4 younger siblings. The ultimate rule they followed was the rule of sleep. The entire operation, the retrieval of the weapon, the movement upstairs, and the execution, was achieved without disturbing the critical silence of the neighborhood. The final horrifying image of the victims found face down, immobile in their beds, was not a sign of demonic influence, but the physical evidence of the killer's cold, absolute control over every single soul in that house, a control he finally seized in the darkness of the fatal hours. The admission of 6 deaths was horrific, but the immediate crisis that confronted the seasoned homicide detectives at 112 Ocean Avenue was the profound, unnatural stillness of the scene. It violated every established rule of a multi-victim homicide. Detectives are trained to anticipate chaos, disorder, and struggle. Here they found only order. 6 victims were discovered in their beds, primarily face down, covers barely disturbed. The rooms were neat, and the bedding was impossibly undisturbed. This chilling serenity was the immediate anomaly, and the detective's first, most urgent psychological defense was to rationalize the calm, to find an external explanation for the impossible order left by a single perpetrator. The psychological pressure to explain the absence of a struggle was immense. Forensically, the neatness implied 2 terrifying possibilities. Either the victims were chemically subdued before the shots were fired, or they were killed in such a rapid sequence that they were paralyzed by fear or surprise. Since chemical sedation was difficult to prove definitively in the early hours, the police were confronted with the overwhelming statistical improbability that all 6 people, including 2 adults, offered zero resistance to an executioner wielding a powerful rifle. This contradicted every study on human survival instincts. This psychological puzzle immediately fueled the initial, most convenient yet utterly flawed theory, the mob hit. The mob hit theory offered a clean, immediate answer to every paradox. It explained the lack of defensive wounds. Professional executioners worked quickly, killing the victims before they could react. It explained the unlocked front door, implying the victims knew their assailants and willingly let them in, or at least offered no resistance to entry. Crucially, the mob theory offered a viable explanation for the sound paradox, suggesting the assassins used suppressors, extreme fear, or other specialized tactics to silence the powerful Marlin .35 caliber rifle used in the massacre. It was easier for law enforcement to accept that highly trained, external killers were at work than to accept the chilling, domestic truth that the son, driven by personal rage, executed his entire family in cold blood and silence. The institutional need for the mob explanation was overwhelming. The police were equipped and trained for external threats, gangs, organized crime, robbery gone wrong. They were fundamentally unprepared to comprehend a domestic breakdown of this cold, systematic magnitude, carried out by a person already known to them. This initial narrative, the mob rationalization, was the shield the police used to manage the unmanageable scale of the carnage. Investigators spent valuable early hours chasing external shadows, looking for large debts, ties to the Genovese or Colombo families, or business dealings that could explain why Ronald DeFeo Sr. would be targeted. This intense pursuit was fruitless. The mob, when it operates, rarely kills children, and the indiscriminate execution of the entire family was an act of personal, total erasure, not professional protocol. The deeper the police looked into the mob theory, the faster it collapsed under the weight of the messy, intimate, personal reality of the DeFeo family's history. The most agonizing paradox that haunted the investigation, forcing them to spend countless hours searching for a scientific impossibility, was the question of the unheard shots. The Marlin 336C was incapable of being silenced effectively with 1970s technology. Its discharge was immense, capable of being heard for hundreds of yards. Yet the nearest neighbors heard nothing. The police hypothesized, were the shots muffled by pillows pressed against the weapon? Was the ambient noise of a passing train or bad weather coincidentally timed to hide the blasts? The ultimate scientific conclusion that the 6 victims were killed in such a precise, rapid sequence that the first shot rendered the subsequent 5 incapable of reacting was too devastating and too cold to readily accept. The total lack of defensive wounds, the undisturbed bedding, and the silence of the neighborhood became the collective physical evidence of the killer's psychological dominance. The investigation's time spent rationalizing the calm was ultimately time lost chasing an easy lie, instead of focusing immediately on the hard, contradictory truth standing right before them. The distraught, drug-addicted son whose fabricated hysteria was the only noise in a house of profound, absolute silence. This institutional failure to prioritize the psychological anomaly over the external conspiracy guaranteed the complexity and failure of the legal battle that would follow. The horrifying discovery of the victims was the single, most definitive piece of evidence that shattered the police's initial assumptions. The physical fact was chilling in its symmetry. All 6 bodies, Ronald Sr., Louise, and the 4 children, were found in the same unnatural posture. They were lying prone, face down in their beds, killed by a high-powered rifle fired at close range. This complete and utter lack of chaos violated every single rule of expected human behavior in the face of violence. Detectives observed no defensive wounds, no torn sheets, and no broken lamps. The sheets remained neatly tucked around the still, silent forms. The scientific contradiction was immediate. The bodies did not die struggling. They died complying. This fact immediately forced investigators away from the chaotic notion of a professional ambush and toward a profound psychological terror. Forensically, the implication of this uniform surrender was devastating. The complete absence of defensive wounds meant that the victims were completely immobile when the shots were fired. The scientific analysis pointed to two possible conclusions, both of which implied a chilling level of calculated control. The first theory, pursued vigorously by investigators, suggested that the family was chemically subdued before the attack, perhaps tranquilized or heavily sedated, to ensure they could not wake up or offer resistance to the loud rifle blasts. While this theory was never definitively proven, it was the only conventional explanation that accounted for the victims' total immobility. The second, more terrifying theory suggested absolute psychological compliance. The victims were given a command to roll over and obeyed, believing that submission might spare them, never anticipating the fatal sequence that followed. The killer had successfully exploited the family's deep-seated pattern of fear and obedience, established over years of living under Ronald Sr.'s tyrannical rule, turning their ingrained subservience into a weapon. This shared posture, the 6 bodies found face down, was the killer's explicit, nonverbal dialogue with the world. This rigid adherence to the prone position revealed the true nature of the perpetrator's mind. It was a deliberate, imposed rule, calculated to assert his final, definitive dominance over the people who had psychologically imprisoned him. The killer enforced the face-down rule for profound reasons. It allowed him to execute the act without having to look into the eyes of his victims, providing a psychological buffer. More fundamentally, it was an act of profound dehumanization, transforming 6 unique individuals into silent, faceless objects of his wrath. The prone position erased their last vestiges of identity and life, fulfilling the killer's psychological need for total, unchallenged control. This terrifying uniformity confirmed that the crime was intensely personal and focused on total annihilation, not mere debt collection. The final, agonizing confirmation of this imposed silence came from the victims who should have fought back, Ronald Sr. and Louise. The adults, whose physical size and experience should have afforded them some opportunity for resistance against a single assailant, showed the same compliance as the children. The fact that even they were found face down, immobile, confirmed that the terror or the surprise was so absolute, or the killer's unique authority over them was so complete, that the will to fight was instantly paralyzed. Their inaction testified to the killer's intimate knowledge of the home's layout, the victims' sleep cycles, and most damningly, the family's complete psychological subservience to the killer himself. This single shared observation, the chilling uniformity of the execution, was the undeniable piece of evidence that permanently tied the crime back to the personal, psychological dynamics of the DeFeo family, finally forcing the police to abandon the convenient lie of the external conspiracy and confront the terrifying truth standing right there. The unstable son, Ronald DeFeo Jr. The horrifying evidence of absolute systemic compliance, the 6 victims found face down in their beds, had definitively established the psychological intimacy of the crime. The focus of the investigation now pivoted from the victim's surrender to the technical facts left by the killer. What detectives found next, however, was a mechanical paradox that made the solo execution seem scientifically impossible. The police easily recovered 6 spent shell casings, 1 for each life taken, all ejected from the .35 caliber Marlin 336C rifle owned by the DeFeo family. This physical fact, the neat pile of brass on the bedroom floors, was the clearest piece of evidence against the killer's narrative. But the true difficulty lay not in finding the shells, but in explaining how they were fired so quickly and quietly. The Marlin 336C is a bolt-action, lever-repeat rifle. This means that after each shot is fired, the user must manually operate the lever beneath the trigger guard to eject the spent casing and cycle a new round into the chamber. This procedure, even for a practiced shooter, requires physical time, a crucial fraction of a second for each of the 6 shots. The psychological tension established by the scene was immense. But the scientific analysis was even more damning. The entire sequence of firing 6 times, moving slightly between shots, and manually resetting the weapon had to occur without waking the remaining 5 victims. Investigators calculated the minimum amount of time required for a skilled operator to execute this 6-step mechanical process and move between the bedrooms. The consensus was that the entire act demanded sustained, concentrated time under pressure. When this necessary procedural time was measured against the 0 reaction time of the victims, who should have awakened at the first, deafening blast of the rifle, the likelihood of a single individual successfully performing the slaughter became statistically remote. The physical demands of the weapon directly contradicted the psychological reality of the undisturbed crime scene. This stark, mechanical paradox immediately fueled 2 intense lines of factual inquiry, both centered on the concept of forced silence. The first line explored the possibility of multiple shooters. To achieve the required speed and complete the executions while maintaining the perfect silence, the most logical explanation was that 2 or more individuals were involved, positioned to fire simultaneously or rapidly, reducing the reaction time for the victims to near 0. This possibility, though never definitively proven, had to be taken seriously, as it aligned better with the scientific reality of the rifle's mechanics than the initial statement from Ronald DeFeo Jr. The second line explored extreme sedation. If the victims were rendered completely immobile, chemically subdued by narcotics, alcohol, or other substances, the mechanical time constraint became irrelevant. The killer could take all the time necessary to manually cycle the rifle 6 times, knowing his victims were incapable of reaction. The intense forensic search for narcotics in the victims' systems became paramount, as it was the only way to scientifically rationalize the physical possibility of the quiet, methodical massacre. The presence of the ejected shells also told a story about the killer's mindset. A highly professional hit team, such as the initial mob rationalization suggested, would have meticulously collected the casings. The killer, Ronnie Jr., left them behind, suggesting either panic or, more likely, a desire to stage the scene as a messy, desperate crime of passion. However, the true contradiction arose during the ballistics analysis. The shells were found neatly ejected onto the bedroom floors, suggesting a shooter who was comfortable, practiced, and strangely controlled during the act. The physical evidence, the number and mechanical function of the shells, instantly became the tool used to break down the killer's subsequent narrative. The police realized the mechanical truth of the weapon directly contradicted the killer's emotional claims of panic and external conspiracy. The investigation moved from asking who was shot to asking how the shooter physically managed the execution, confirming that the person who pulled the trigger was cold, precise, and faced an immense unexplainable physical challenge to complete the task. The admission of 6 deaths was the initial shock, but the real fight began in the cold, late-night hours of the police station interrogation room. The detectives, seasoned veterans who had seen every form of human depravity, allowed Ronald DeFeo Jr. to exhaust his initial frantic performance. He had come prepared with an elaborate story, weaving a tale of a mob hit, a deadly retribution carried out by a hitman named Louis Falanga over a business debt owed by his father. This lie was Ronnie Jr.'s attempt to rationalize the irrationality of the crime. The mob explained the execution style, the unlocked door, implying the assassins were let in, and the impossible silence, suggesting professional suppressors. This narrative was a shield, an external explanation for a deeply internal, personal act of violence, and the detectives listened patiently, gathering the threads of the deception. The investigation's turning point was not a piece of new physical evidence, but the application of simple, undeniable facts against the fantasy. The detectives, relentless and focused, began to use the scene itself, the victims' bodies and the weapon mechanics, to break the lie. They focused on the profound inconsistencies. Firstly, they knew the mob used specific tools of the trade. They did not use a common Marlin 336C hunting rifle. Professional executioners rely on silence and efficiency, and the execution was anything but clean in the professional sense. Secondly, the execution of 4 young, non-threatening children defied all protocol and logic of organized crime. Mob hits are calculated to send a specific message to a target or rival. They do not engage in the indiscriminate wholesale obliteration of an entire family, especially not the children. This mass murder was an act of personal, total erasure, not professional debt collection. The detectives hammered these points, watching Ronnie Jr.'s rehearsed grief slowly dissolve into fear and anger. The interrogation shifted from questioning the mob hit to questioning the sequence of events. Detectives used the physical paradox of the unheard shots, Part 4, and the mechanical reality of the rifle, Part 6, to close in. They asked him how one man alone could manually cycle a bolt-action rifle 6 times, move between 2 floors, and maintain sufficient speed and accuracy without waking anyone, especially the adults. The story began to unravel. His answers became vague, his timeline contradictory, and his initial hysteria evaporated, replaced by cold, calculating defiance. The investigators then delivered the ultimate psychological blow, the evidence of the silent bodies, Part 5. They revealed that all 6 victims were found face down, immobile, clearly indicating a rule of absolute compliance and control. This was not the work of terrified victims hiding from hitmen. This was the work of a single intimate authority figure imposing their will. Cornered by the immutable facts of the scene, Ronnie Jr.'s elaborate external lie finally collapsed. The desperate performance was over, and the truth, though quickly obscured by a new set of lies, finally emerged. Ronnie Jr. broke down and admitted he was the shooter, but instead of accepting the obvious motive, rage, addiction, and resentment, he immediately replaced the mob narrative with a new, equally elaborate defense. He claimed he was driven by the voices within the house, screaming at him to commit the murders. The police had their killer, but the true agony was the immediate realization that the subsequent legal battle would be fought not over who pulled the trigger, but over the terrifying blurred line between human rage and supernatural influence. The interrogation confirmed the most critical truth. The execution was personal, the control was absolute, and the psychological sickness that fueled the massacre came directly from within the walls of that beautiful house. The admission of guilt from Ronald DeFeo Jr. immediately transformed the homicide investigation into a desperate, chaotic legal war, moving the primary conflict from the scene of the crime to the courtroom. The police's job was over. The defense lawyer's job, to save the admitted killer from maximum sentence, was just beginning. The sheer coldness and brutality of the massacre demanded an explanation that transcended normal crime, and the defense team launched their ultimate sensational strategy, the insanity defense. This narrative was radical, calculated, and legally crucial. Ronnie Jr. claimed he was tormented by the voices emanating from the house, screaming at him, "Kill them! Kill them!" The defense argued that the beautiful Dutch colonial on Ocean Avenue was possessed by a malevolent force that drove their client, a young man already struggling with drug abuse and emotional fragility, to commit the execution. This defense created a profound legal and psychological crisis for the state of New York. The court was suddenly tasked with the impossible, separating a genuine claim of temporary madness from a cold, self-serving legal fabrication. The ensuing trial quickly devolved into a theatrical and expensive battle of psychiatric experts, turning the courtroom into a forum for warring definitions of delusion and responsibility. The defense presented psychiatrists who supported the claim that Ronnie Jr. was suffering from dissociative episodes, possibly a deep-seated mental illness, and was genuinely acting under the influence of an external, compelling force, the evil spirits of the house. This testimony provided the necessary legal ambiguity to argue for diminished capacity, suggesting Ronnie Jr. lacked the necessary criminal intent, mens rea, due to his perceived mental state. The prosecution, fighting against this sensational narrative, was forced to counter with technical, factual arguments. Their experts testified that while Ronnie Jr. was clearly an antisocial and volatile individual, his actions were not driven by clinical schizophrenia but by conscious rage, fueled and amplified by his severe narcotic-induced psychosis. The documented consumption of heroin, LSD, and alcohol that night. The true crisis lay in separating the impact of the house from the chemical reality. The defense meticulously avoided focusing on the drugs, instead arguing that the chemical abuse merely opened the door to the supernatural influence of the location. The court struggled immensely with this ambiguity. Were the voices genuine symptoms of mental illness? Were they the temporary hallucinations caused by a powerful cocktail of substances? Or were they merely a convenient narrative designed by defense counsel The deeper truth, often obscured by the legal posturing, was the intersection of human rage and mental instability. Ronnie Jr. was raised in an environment of constant aggressive abuse, Part 2, which already compromised his psychological well-being. The drug use was merely the accelerant that lit the pre-existing fuse of his resentment toward Ronald Sr. The defense's genius was successfully reframing this human, predictable breakdown, the son killing the source of his oppression as a mysterious external influence. This strategy shifted the legal focus away from the concrete facts of abuse and financial desperation and onto the abstract, sensational concept of the house is evil. This legal strategy was the crucial, irreversible action that transformed a brutal domestic homicide into the foundation of the supernatural legend. By successfully introducing the idea of external demonic compulsion, the defense inadvertently provided the perfect, enduring fictional narrative that would later consume the property and the public imagination. The legal system, designed to handle rational human motives, was forced to contend with the irrational, and in its struggle, it validated the existence of the Amityville Horror. The trial's ultimate failure was not necessarily the conviction itself, but the inability of the court to definitively and clearly define the motive as purely human rage, leaving the public with the lingering, sensational question: was the killer a man or was he a demon, protecting himself behind the walls of his family's beautiful, tragic tomb? The trial had been a sensationalized circus, consumed by the legal strategy that tried to blame the beautiful house for the violence. Yet the ultimate revelation, the truth that was constantly obscured by the defense's claims of madness and possession, was entirely human, simple, and far more terrifying than any ghost story. The true horror of Amityville was not metaphysical. It was the sound of a family unit collapsing under the weight of greed, drug abuse, and unchecked violence. This was the factual case the prosecution argued relentlessly. The motive was not a curse, but cash, and the killer was fueled not by a spirit, but by pure entitled rage. The central trigger of the massacre was financial. Ronnie Jr., deeply immersed in drug dependency, was draining the family's wealth and creating massive, unpredictable financial liabilities for his father. The confrontation hours before the murder was the final, explosive culmination of this monetary strain. Ronald Sr. had cut off his son's access to the family funds and was threatening to remove him entirely from the lucrative car dealership business. For Ronnie Jr., who lived a life of entitled dependency, this threat was an existential crisis. It meant the permanent loss of his primary source of income and his only means to fund his intense drug habit. The murder became a calculated solution to a financial problem, eliminating the source of his subjugation and inheriting the family's assets, thereby buying his freedom and his next fix. This financial motive was inextricably linked to the severe abuse cycle that defined the DeFeo household. Ronnie Jr.'s execution of his father was the final, devastating reaction to years of systemic psychological and physical tyranny. Part 2. Ronald Sr.'s abuse was the deep-seated wound. The drugs were the chemical accelerant, and the financial cutoff was the final immediate catalyst. The execution was an act of complete emancipation, the desire to eliminate the person who had become the source of all his resentment. The fact that he systematically eliminated his mother and all 4 siblings speaks to the terrible realization that he could eliminate the patriarch, but not the witnesses, nor the potential inheritors of the wealth he desperately craved. The crime was total because the killer sought total control over the legacy. The prosecution's powerful revelation was the reconstruction of the night's factual timeline, demonstrating the conscious deliberation of the killer. The defense's claim of the voices was factually contradicted by the structured, methodical nature of the attack. The killer retrieved the powerful Marlin rifle, found the ammunition, and systematically moved through the house. Actions that demand cognitive function and planning, not blind, possessed rage. This was not a crime of passion. It was a cold, sobered decision to kill his way out of a financial and emotional prison. The choice to fire 6 precise shots, ensuring every witness was silenced, confirmed that the killer's goal was survival and gain, not chaotic spiritual release. Ultimately, the true, agonizing horror of Amityville was not the sound of phantom footsteps or whispers. It was the chilling human sound of the final, desperate argument over money, drugs, and power that led to a son deciding that the only rule the family would ever follow again was the rule of silence. a rule he brutally enforced on them all. This factual truth remains far more terrifying than any ghost story ever written. The legal battle over Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s sanity was a chaotic, defining moment for the case, but the court's ultimate duty was clear. The facts of the crime had to outweigh the sensational claims of the defense. Despite the lawyers' relentless efforts to blame the voices emanating from 112 Ocean Avenue, the jury rejected the supernatural narrative. They found Ronnie Jr. responsible for his actions, concluding that the massacre was the culmination of conscious, human rage fueled by drug psychosis and years of deep-seated familial resentment, not demonic possession. The court delivered the verdict. Ronnie Jr. was convicted on 6 counts of second-degree murder, receiving 6 consecutive sentences of 25 years to life. This judicial conclusion marked the end of the legal process, the institutional survival action that formally closed the case file on the killer. The system had, in its own way, affirmed the prosecution's central argument. The horror of Amityville was human, not supernatural. However, the state's survival action was immediately undermined by a catastrophic institutional failure that had nothing to do with police procedure and everything to do with real estate and public narrative control. The conviction ended the legal crisis, but it failed to contain the story. The victims were gone, the killer was jailed, and the house itself became a massive financial liability and a psychological burden for the remaining family estates. The primary action taken by the surviving parties was to sell the property immediately. The house was placed on the market almost shockingly quickly, with the full knowledge that the property carried the heaviest psychological baggage in American criminal history. This act, the quick, desperate sale, was the critical institutional failure that allowed the supernatural myth to permanently take root. The legal system had successfully removed the man, but the economic system failed to contain the psychological fallout of the location. The house, which should have been secured and perhaps even studied, was instead quickly transferred to new, unsuspecting ownership. This provided a crucial open stage for the next set of events. The family's priority was financial, but their quick sale meant they effectively released the crime scene into the hands of the public imagination, ensuring that the true, factual horror would be immediately obscured by fiction. The sale itself became the turning point for the legend. Furthermore, even after the guilty verdict was delivered, Ronnie Jr. maintained the narrative that fueled the sensationalism. He consistently argued that he was coerced into the initial confession and that the voices were real, feeding the public's insatiable hunger for the paranormal. His stubborn insistence, maintained for decades in prison, ensured that the official legal verdict was always countered by the chilling, whispered possibility of external evil. The system incarcerated the killer, but was utterly powerless to stop the lie that he had manufactured from taking hold. The house was sold, the public was left with a sensationalized story, and the stage was set for the next family to enter the beautiful, scarred Dutch colonial. The final price of justice was not the conviction of the killer, but the permanent loss of the truth, sacrificed to the economic need to sell a house and the psychological need to believe in a convenient, external demon rather than the horror that can be contained within any normal family. The conviction of Ronald DeFeo Jr. closed the legal file on the killer, but the narrative crisis was far from over. The institutional failure to contain the psychological fallout of the house, culminating in the immediate sale of the property, left the crime scene vulnerable to exploitation. Enter George and Kathy Lutz, the new owners who purchased 112 Ocean Avenue for a dramatically reduced price, thanks to the recent notorious history of the 6 executions. Their arrival marked the official birth of the Amityville Horror myth, a sensationalized legacy that would permanently overshadow the factual tragedy of the DeFeo family's final hours. The Lutzes moved into the house in December 1975, exactly 1 year after the murders, representing a new, perhaps naive set of victims not of a killer, but of the house's intense public infamy. Their stay was famously short, just 28 days. But the stories they emerged with were meticulously crafted to align with the sensational psychiatric defense that had failed Ronnie Jr. Part 8. They claimed extreme paranormal phenomena: green slime oozing from the walls, objects flying, cold spots, the sounds of marching, and Kathy Lutz reportedly levitated while sleeping. Most chillingly, George Lutz claimed to see the face of a demonic pig, and the entire family insisted they were driven out by an overwhelming, invisible, malevolent presence. This immediate, sensational narrative was the final devastating transformation of the original crime. The factual details of human rage, drug psychosis, and domestic violence were immediately replaced by a highly marketable fiction. The critical turning point was the collaboration between the Lutz family and author J. Anson. The moment the family began to monetize their short stay, detailing their experiences to writers and media outlets, the focus shifted from finding truth to maximizing profit. The alleged haunting was perfectly timed and packaged for a nation hungry for supernatural explanations for crimes that defied rational motive. The book and subsequent film rights exploded into a massive global economic enterprise, confirming that the ultimate motive for the legend was not malevolence, but money. The story became a runaway success precisely because it offered a comforting, external explanation for the horrific slaughter. It wasn't the sun, it was the house. This external demon hypothesis was much easier for the public psyche to accept than the stark, psychological terror that one family member could systematically execute 6 others in cold blood. The legacy was cemented by the involvement of paranormal investigators, demonologists, and psychics who flocked to the house, eager to validate the haunting claims. This influx of non-scientific conjecture further obscured the initial forensic facts of the DeFeo murders. When the science and the legal system failed to contain the truth, Part 10, the void was aggressively filled by sensationalism. While the true crime investigation ended with the conviction of Ronnie Jr., the psychological warfare waged by the media and the new occupants ensured that the real, terrifying human story was drowned out by phantom noises and tales of levitation. The result was the permanent, chilling legacy. 112 Ocean Avenue became more famous for the 28 days of its supernatural haunting than for the 6 executions that happened years before. The house was no longer a crime scene. It was a profitable, terrifying myth, guaranteeing that the true horror, the human one, would remain forever overshadowed by the compelling lie of the supernatural. The house was fully free from the accountability of the murder, ready to carry its new frightening identity into history. The story of Amityville is not merely the story of a murder. It is the ultimate American collision between devastating human reality and profitable supernatural fiction. We have followed the facts, the brutal executions, the silence of the victims, the psychological evidence of absolute compliance, and the legal verdict that convicted Ronald DeFeo Jr. The final act of this tragedy was the creation of the myth, the immediate financial exploitation that birthed the enduring legend that the house was haunted. The true horror was jailed, but the story went free, transforming a son's act of rage and addiction into a universal tale of demonic possession. The verdict of history must, however, return to the chilling, uncomfortable truth established by the courtroom. The terror was human, predictable, and systemic. The real rule of 112 Ocean Avenue was established long before the tragic events of November 1974. It was the rule of silence and subjugation, enforced by the tyranny of Ronald DeFeo Sr. Every member of the family was conditioned to obey the primary source of rage and conflict within the household. The core truth of the crime is that Ronnie Jr. used the rifle to violently enforce the ultimate, final rule of silence, eliminating his entire family to gain freedom and control over the family's assets. The crime was a desperate, systematic solution to a financial and psychological problem. The supernatural claims, the green slime, the levitation, the voices all serve one final, profound purpose: to obscure the terrifying simplicity of the human motive. It is easier for the public psyche to accept a demon than to accept the psychological truth that a person, fueled by drugs and resentment, can simply choose to execute their entire sleeping family without external cause. The never follow the rules metaphor serves as the final, agonizing commentary on the human element. The only rules that mattered were the ones of abuse and financial desperation. The legacy of Amityville is the terrifying success of a profitable lie. The quick sale of the house immediately after the conviction guaranteed that the factual crime would be permanently overshadowed by the sensational fiction. The media, the authors, and the subsequent occupants successfully transformed the house into an object of fascination, ensuring that the true horror, the systemic domestic violence, the drug-induced paranoia, and the execution of children would be constantly masked by ghost stories. The verdict of history affirms that the legal system though it convicted the killer, was ultimately powerless against the forces of economic sensationalism. The terror endures because the ambiguity, born from the initial failure to account for the sound paradox, remains a lucrative product. The final truth that remains is the chilling, confirmed reality that the murderer was a man, and the only rules he followed were his own. The house stands as a monument to human rage, permanently shrouded by the legend it inspired. The Amityville story is the definitive lesson in separating truth from profitable fiction. The facts of the case, the precise time, the specific weapon, the execution of the 6 victims, all point to a human breakdown, not a demonic invasion. The only house that was truly haunted was the psychological prison created by the family's own fear. The question for you remains, knowing the scientific facts, the lack of struggle, the drug use, and the financial motive, do you believe Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s confession of the voices was a genuine plea for help? For the greatest, most successful legal fabrication in true crime history? Let me know your verdict on the true killer's motive in the comments below. Do you choose the human horror or the supernatural comfort? If you dare to delve deeper into the systemic failures and psychological breakdowns behind America's most famous murders, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is Mr. Nightmare signing off.